Close your eyes, if you would like to, and let your body settle into whatever surface holds you now, whether that is a bed, a couch, the gentle cradle of a chair that knows the shape of you well enough by now. Let the weight of the day begin its slow departure, like fog lifting from a still river in the earliest hours of morning, unhurried, inevitable, and beautifully silent. Breathe in just once, deeply, and hold it for a moment, and then let it go. Let it drift away, and as it drifts, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a very old garden, a garden that has existed in some form or another. For as long as human beings have walked upon the earth and learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, which things were safe to touch and which things were not. This garden is quiet tonight, as all gardens are at this hour, and the moonlight falls softly across rows of plants that are, in their own way, among the most remarkable and most quietly powerful organisms that have ever grown from soil. They do not move, these plants. They do not speak. They do not reach for you in the darkness. And yet, across the entire span of human history, they have shaped the course of medicine, of murder, of mythology, of governance, and of grief, in ways that are deeply and endlessly fascinating to trace. Through centuries and continents and cultures, from the earliest herbalists of ancient Egypt to the pharmacologists of the modern laboratory. Welcome to Plague Lullaby. If this voice helps you rest tonight, consider subscribing, but only if you are still awake to do so. And if you are already drifting, then let us begin together, slowly, as all good journeys through history ought to begin. At the very mildest edge of the spectrum, where the leaves are merely unwelcoming, and work our way, gently and without urgency, toward the far end of the garden, where the soil grows darker, and the flowers have names that even botanists speak with a certain careful reverence. It is worth beginning with the understanding that toxicity is not a simple thing, not a binary condition of safe or dangerous, but rather a vast and nuanced continuum that has fascinated physicians, poisoners, herbalists, and philosophers in equal measure for thousands of years. The Swiss-German physician Paracelsus, born in 1493 in the canton of Schwyz, was among the first to articulate what has since become one of the foundational principles of the science of toxicology, a principle so elegant in its simplicity that it has survived essentially unchanged into the 21st century, which is this: the dose makes the poison. He wrote in the early 16th century that all things are poison and nothing is without poison, and that only the dose determines whether a thing will harm or heal. A statement that resonates as deeply now as it did in the era of alchemists and court physicians. Paracelsus was himself a figure of considerable peculiarity, a man who rejected the dominant medical traditions of his time, who burned the works of Galen and Avicenna in a public bonfire in Basel in 1527 to signal his departure from the old ways of thinking, and who wandered the roads of Europe in a manner that his contemporaries found deeply suspicious, and that later generations would come to regard as the beginning of something like empirical medicine. His insight about dosage was not entirely new, for herbalists had known for centuries that the same plant could cure a fever in small amounts and stop a heart in large ones, but he gave it a framework, a language, and a philosophical grounding that allowed the study of poisons to become, over the following centuries, the study of pharmacology. And so it is in this spirit, the spirit of Paracelsus and his long contemplative walks, through fields of herbs and minerals, that we begin our survey tonight, moving with unhurried patience from the gentlest end of the botanical toxicity spectrum toward its most solemn and final expression. At the very mildest edge of our spectrum, There are plants so common in domestic gardens and kitchen windowsills that the idea of their toxicity strikes most people as slightly surprising, a gentle correction to the assumption that beautiful things in pots on sunlit shelves are inherently benign. Consider the tomato plant, Solanum lycopersicum, which has graced the gardens of Europe since it was brought from the Americas. In the 16th century, introduced to Spain and Portugal by explorers who had encountered it growing in the gardens of the Aztec civilization in what is now Mexico, where it had been cultivated for centuries under the Nahuatl name tomatl, meaning the swelling fruit. When the tomato first arrived in Europe, it was regarded with deep suspicion for several generations, partly because European botanists correctly identified it as a member of the Solanaceae family, the nightshade family, and understood that many of its relatives were poisonous, and partly because the large pewter plates on which wealthy Europeans dined in the 16th and 17th centuries had a high lead content, and the acidity of the tomato caused lead to leach from the plates into the food, contributing to a pattern of illness that was blamed, quite reasonably from the available evidence, on the fruit itself. The leaves and stems of the tomato plant contain a glycoalkaloid compound called tomatine, as well as solanine, both of which are mildly toxic to humans in large quantities, though the concentrations found in mature fruit are generally considered too low to cause significant harm to a healthy adult. And the green, unripened fruit contains higher concentrations of these compounds than the fully ripened red ones. For centuries, however, the tomato was cultivated in European gardens primarily as an ornamental plant, its beauty appreciated, and its fruit left untouched. And it was not until the 18th century that it became widely accepted as a food crop in Italy, with its culinary use spreading gradually north and west across the continent over the following decades. The story of the tomato is in many ways an illustration of how human beings navigate the uncertain boundary between the edible and the poisonous, relying on accumulated cultural knowledge, on trial and error, on observation across generations, and on the slow and patient work of physicians and naturalists who attempted to systematize what the folk herbalists had known empirically for a very long time. Meanwhile, the tomato's close relation, shares this same mild toxicity in its non-edible parts, and the nightshade family to which they both belong would come to occupy an increasingly significant place in our story as we move along the spectrum toward its darker end. Rhubarb is another plant that occupies this gentle, cautionary middle ground between the wholly benign and the genuinely dangerous, and its story unfolds across centuries and continents in a way that rewards slow attention. The stalks of rhubarb, Rheum rhabarbarum, are entirely edible and have been eaten in the form of pies and preserves across Britain and North America since the 18th century. When the plant was first cultivated in English kitchen gardens, having been introduced from China, where it had been used for medicinal purposes, primarily as a laxative, for several thousand years, with records of its use in traditional Chinese medicine dating back to approximately 2700 BCE, attributed in legend to the Emperor Shennong, who is said to have tasted hundreds of plants in order to understand their properties, and to have compiled the knowledge that became the foundational text of Chinese herbal medicine, the Shennong Bencao Jing. The leaves of the rhubarb plant, however, are a different matter entirely, for they contain very high concentrations of oxalic acid, as well as anthraquinone glycosides, and their ingestion in sufficient quantity can cause a range of effects, including kidney damage, difficulty breathing, and in severe cases, failure of the renal system. During the First World War, a period of considerable food scarcity in Britain, the British government issued guidance recommending rhubarb leaves as a vegetable substitute, guidance that was subsequently reversed when it became clear that the leaves were causing illness among civilians who followed the advice. An episode that stands as a reminder that the boundary between food and poison is not always clearly marked, and that official pronouncements about the safety of plant material do not always keep pace with botanical knowledge. The roots of the rhubarb plant contain even higher concentrations of oxalic acid than the leaves, and the medicinal rhubarb used in Chinese and later European pharmacopoeias was handled with considerable care by apothecaries who understood, if not always in chemical terms, that the same plant that moved the bowels gently in small doses could do serious harm in larger ones, which returns us quietly to Paracelsus and his enduring insight about the nature of poison. It is worth noting that rhubarb was one of the most valuable trade commodities on the Silk Road during the medieval period, fetching prices comparable to saffron and opium, valued primarily for its medicinal properties rather than its culinary ones, and that merchants travelled great distances to obtain it from the regions of Central Asia and China, where it grew most abundantly. The foxglove, Digitalis purpurea, presents us with a case that illustrates perhaps more beautifully than almost any other plant the paradox at the heart of botanical toxicology, which is that the same compound that kills in excess can sustain life in the correct measure, and that the history of medicine is in no small part a history of learning to walk that delicate line with increasing precision. The foxglove is a tall and graceful biennial plant, native to Western and Central Europe, adorned with tubular flowers of a deep purple pink that hang in long one-sided clusters from a central stem, each flower marked on its interior with spots that suggest, to the imagination, eyes looking out from within the bell, and it has been growing wild in the hedgerows and woodland margins of Britain and Ireland for as long as there have been hedgerows and woodland margins to grow in. The common English name foxglove is old, recorded in the earliest botanical texts of the Anglo-Saxon tradition, though its precise etymology has been debated by scholars for centuries, without arriving at a consensus that fully satisfies. And in Welsh, the plant is called Bysedicorn, meaning fingers of the hounds, while in German it is Fingerhut, meaning thimble, each name reaching for a different aspect of the flower's distinctive shape. The active compounds in the foxglove are a group of steroidal glycosides known as cardiac glycosides, including digitoxin and digoxin, which act on the heart muscle by inhibiting the sodium-potassium ATPase enzyme, increasing the force of cardiac contractions and slowing the heart rate, effects that are profoundly beneficial in certain kinds of heart failure and profoundly dangerous in excess. The plant had been used in folk medicine across the British Isles for generations before it was formally introduced to orthodox medical practice, and it was a Shropshire physician named William Withering who, in 1785, published his landmark study, Account of the Foxglove and some of its medical uses, a document based on 10 years of careful clinical observation involving over 100 patients, in which he described with meticulous attention the conditions under which the plant was beneficial and those under which it was dangerous, a work that is considered one of the founding documents of modern clinical pharmacology, and that is still read by medical historians with admiration for its clarity and its patience. Withering himself learned of the plant's medicinal uses from a woman in Shropshire, whom he described simply as an old woman of Shropshire, a folk herbalist, whose knowledge of the local plant medicines had been accumulated over a lifetime, and he spent years refining the preparation and dosage based on what she knew, which suggests that the boundary between folk knowledge and scientific medicine is more permeable and more mutually dependent than either tradition sometimes acknowledges. The common garden daffodil, Narcissus pseudonarcissus, is another plant that sits at the milder end of our spectrum, while still containing compounds significant enough to warrant careful respect, and its story is woven through with mythology and history in ways that make it a peculiarly poignant subject for contemplation in the quiet hours. Daffodils contain alkaloids, chiefly lycorine and galanthamine, concentrated most heavily in the bulbs, but present throughout the plant, and ingestion of the bulbs, which have occasionally been mistaken for onions, causes a range of symptoms including nausea, vomiting, abdominal discomfort, and in severe cases, cardiac arrhythmia, though fatalities from daffodil ingestion are relatively rare and most exposures result in discomfort rather than lasting harm. The genus Narcissus takes its name from the figure in Greek mythology, the beautiful youth Narcissus, who, according to the version recorded by the Roman poet Ovid in his Metamorphoses, completed around 8 CE, fell so deeply in love with his own reflection in a forest pool that he was unable to leave it, and eventually wasted away at the water's edge, transforming at the moment of his death into the flower that bears his name. A story that the Greeks and Romans associated with themes of beauty, obsession, and the consolation that the natural world offers to those who have suffered irreversible loss. The ancient Greeks believed that the narcissus was the flower of the dead, and it was said to grow in abundance in the meadows of the underworld, the asphodel meadows, through which the shades of the deceased wandered in Hades, which gives the mild toxicity of the plant a certain mythological appropriateness, for it is a plant that belongs, in the Greek imagination, to the borderland between the living and the dead. Galanthamine, the alkaloid extracted from the snowdrop, Galanthus nivalis, a close relative of the narcissus, has found a remarkable modern application as a treatment for the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration in 2001, under the trade name Razidine, which is a reminder that the story of botanical toxicity is never entirely a story of danger, but always simultaneously a story of potential, of the slow discovery of what a molecule can do when it is placed in the right context, at the right dose, in the right body. Meanwhile, as we move along the spectrum from the daffodil toward plants of greater potency and more immediate consequence, the garden grows darker and more still, and the moon above it seems to cast a more considered light, as though it too understands that what lies ahead requires a certain careful attention. The story of oleander, Nerium oleander, takes us into a region of the spectrum where the potential for serious harm becomes considerably more pronounced, and where the history of the plant's interaction with human beings involves not merely discomfort or cautionary tales of mistaken identity, but genuine tragedy played out across centuries and geographies with a consistency that speaks to the extraordinary potency of the cardiac glycosides it contains. Oleander is one of the most widely cultivated ornamental shrubs in the warmer regions of the world. Its deep green lance-shaped leaves and clusters of flowers in shades of white, pink, red, and yellow, making it a staple of Mediterranean gardens, coastal promenades, highway median plantings, and suburban landscapes from California to the Canary Islands to the Indian subcontinent, and it grows with an ease and a vigor that belies the fact that every part of it, from root to petal, contains compounds that are deeply and swiftly injurious to the cardiovascular system. The cardiac glycosides in oleander, primarily oleandrin and narine, act in a manner broadly similar to those in the foxglove, inhibiting the sodium-potassium pump in cardiac muscle cells and causing disruption to the normal electrical conduction of the heart. But the concentrations of these compounds in oleander are considerably higher than in most clinical preparations of foxglove derivatives, and the margin between a dose that causes symptoms and a dose that is fatal is narrow enough to be deeply concerning. There is a story, repeated in various forms, in accounts of the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century, though its precise historical provenance is difficult to verify with absolute certainty, that a group of French soldiers encamped somewhere in the Mediterranean region used branches of oleander to skewer their meat over a campfire, and that several of them died as a result of oleandrin leaching from the wood into the food, a story that may be apocryphal in its specific details, but that accurately reflects the genuine danger of using oleander wood for any purpose that involves contact with food or skin. What is documented with more certainty is the long history of oleander's use in traditional medicine across the Indian subcontinent, where it appears in Ayurvedic texts under the Sanskrit name Karvira, and was employed in very carefully controlled preparations for the treatment of skin conditions, heart conditions, and as a component of certain ritualistic practices, with the understanding, built into the tradition itself, that the plant required the most careful handling and the most precise measurement of any material in the apothecary's cabinet. In Sri Lanka and certain regions of southern India, accidental and intentional oleander poisoning involving the yellow oleander, Cascabella thevetia, has historically been a significant cause of hospital admissions, and epidemiological studies conducted in the late 20th century identified it as one of the most common means of intentional self-harm in certain rural communities, leading to the establishment of specialized treatment protocols at hospitals throughout the region and to public health campaigns aimed at reducing the accessibility of the plant in areas where it was most commonly used in this manner. The physical beauty of the oleander, its long association with warmth and leisure, and the pleasant landscapes of the Mediterranean world stands in a relationship of the most profound irony with its toxicological profile. And it is perhaps this contrast, the contrast between apparent benevolence and concealed danger, that has made it a recurring figure in the literature and mythology of the cultures that have grown it alongside their homes for centuries. Hemlock, Conium maculatum, carries with it a weight of historical and philosophical significance that distinguishes it from almost every other plant in our survey, for it is the plant most closely associated with one of the most famous deaths in the history of Western civilization, a death that took place in the city of Athens in the year 399 BCE, and that has been contemplated, analysed, mourned, and debated by philosophers, physicians, and historians across the 24 centuries that have followed it. The man who drank the hemlock was Socrates, the Athenian philosopher who had spent the better part of his 70 years walking the streets of Athens and asking questions, deeply uncomfortable questions, about the nature of justice and virtue and knowledge and the good life, questions that eventually led to his trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of the city, his conviction by a jury of 500 Athenian citizens, and his sentence of death by the drinking of a preparation made from the hemlock plant, ground that same day in the prison where he awaited his execution. The account of Socrates' death that has come down to us was written by his student, Plato, in the dialogue known as the Phaedo, composed some years after the event from the accounts of those who had been present, and it describes with a remarkable and deeply moving stillness how Socrates spent his final hours in conversation with his friends about the immortality of the soul, how he bathed so as not to give the women the trouble of washing a corpse, how he drank the cup that was brought to him without hesitation or complaint, and how the paralysis began in his feet and moved upward through his legs and his abdomen and toward his chest, the numbness advancing with the slow certainty of the tide coming in across a flat shore. The toxin responsible for this progression is an alkaloid called coneine, which acts as a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor antagonist, blocking the transmission of nerve signals to the muscles and producing an ascending paralysis that begins peripherally and moves toward the center, with death resulting ultimately from respiratory failure when the paralysis reaches the muscles of the chest and diaphragm. Hemlock, Conium maculatum, is a tall biennial plant of the carrot family, Apiaceae, native to Europe and Western Asia, with hollow stems marked by distinctive reddish-purple blotches and small white flowers, arranged in umbrella-shaped clusters called umbels that closely resemble the flowers of edible plants such as cow parsley, wild carrot, and sweet cicely, a resemblance that has caused a number of accidental poisonings throughout history among foragers who did not know, or did not know well enough, how to distinguish between them. The plant was used as the official means of execution in ancient Athens for those convicted of capital crimes, meaning that it occupied a formal legal and civic function, quite unlike most of the plants in our survey, and that its properties were well known to the Athenian authorities, who had experience with it as an instrument of the state's most final power, which is the power to end a life in an orderly and controlled manner, and to call the result justice. Water hemlock, Cicuta maculata, a North American species that is a close relative of Conium maculatum, rather than a direct botanical equivalent that contains a different and even more rapidly acting toxin called cycitoxin, and has been described by a number of modern botanists and toxicologists as probably the most acutely toxic plant native to North America, capable of causing violent convulsions and death within a matter of hours, and sometimes much sooner than that, following the ingestion of even a small quantity of the root. Aconitum, the genus that contains the plants known variously as monkhood, wolfsbane, and aconite, represents a profound escalation in the potency and the historical significance of the botanical toxins we are examining, and it occupies a place in the mythology, the criminal history, and the pharmacological literature of the world that is difficult to overstate without drifting toward the very urgency that a program like this one gently declines to embrace. There are more than 250 species within the genus Aconitum, distributed across the mountainous regions of the Northern Hemisphere, from the high meadows of the Alps and the Pyrenees to the slopes of the Himalayas and the mountains of Japan, and the most familiar of them in the European tradition is Aconitum napellus, a plant of striking appearance, with deeply lobed leaves and tall spikes of hooded blue-violet flowers, whose upper petal curves forward in a shape that medieval herbalists found reminiscent of a monk's cowl, hence the name monk's hood, while the name wolfsbane reflects the plant's long history of use in the killing of wolves and other predatory animals by the mixing of its crushed roots into bait. The active toxin in aconitum is aconitine, an alkaloid of extraordinary potency that works by binding to voltage-gated sodium channels in the cell membranes of nerve and muscle tissue, holding those channels open and preventing the normal cycle of depolarization. And repolarization that allows nerve cells and muscle cells to function, an effect that produces, in the heart, a catastrophic disruption of the electrical conduction system, causing ventricular arrhythmias that can be fatal within a matter of hours, and sometimes within an hour or less of ingestion of a significant dose. The ancient Greeks believed that the aconite plant had grown from the saliva of Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the entrance to the underworld, dripping from the beasts' mouths, as Heracles dragged him up into the light of day during the 12th of his labors. And the plant was sacred to Teheke, the goddess of witchcraft and the night, who is said in the accounts of Diodorus Siculus to have discovered its toxic properties and first employed them. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in the late 1st century BCE and early 1st century CE, called aconite the stepmother's poison, a phrase that speaks to the plant's reputation in the Roman world as the instrument of domestic murder, the poison of the household. And there is a tradition, reported by the Roman historian Suetonius, that the Emperor Claudius, who died in 54 CE, was poisoned by his wife Agrippina with a preparation of aconite administered in a dish of mushrooms, though the historical evidence for this is a matter of scholarly discussion rather than settled fact. Emperor Trajan, who ruled Rome from 98 to 117 CE, is recorded to have issued an edict banning the cultivation of aconite in Roman domestic gardens, which tells us something about how seriously the plant's dangers were regarded by the authorities of the ancient world, and about how widely it must have been grown in private spaces for the edict to have been considered necessary. The first documented case of aconitine poisoning, tried as a murder in an English court, occurred in 1881, when a physician named George Henry Lamson was convicted of murdering his brother-in-law, Percy John, by administering aconitine in a piece of cake at a school in Wimbledon, a case that attracted considerable public attention, and that contributed to a more widespread awareness of the plant's lethal potential among the educated classes of Victorian Britain. In more recent history, a case from 2009 in the United Kingdom involved a woman who travelled to India specifically to procure aconitine, extracted from an Indian species of the plant and returned to administer it in a curry, a case that became known in the British press as the curry killer case, and that demonstrated with a certain grim clarity that the ancient plant and its ancient toxin remain entirely capable, across all the centuries of pharmacological progress, of doing precisely what they have always done. Belladonna, Atropa belladonna, is perhaps the most storied of all the plants in the nightshade family, and its story stretches from the mythological landscapes of ancient Greece, through the apothecary shops of Renaissance Italy, through the laboratories of 19th century German chemists, and into the operating theatres and ophthalmology clinics of the modern hospital, where the alkaloids derived from it continue to be used in medicine today, a journey of some 4,000 years that illustrates with particular clarity how a plant can be simultaneously a poison, a cosmetic, a tool of witchcraft, a sacrament, and a pharmaceutical agent, depending entirely on the context in which it is encountered. The name belladonna means beautiful woman in Italian, and it refers to the practice, widespread among women of Renaissance Italy, and later of Parisian society, of instilling drops of juice pressed from the berries of the plant into the eyes to dilate the pupils, an effect that was considered enormously attractive in that era's aesthetic of large, dark, luminous eyes, achieved at a cost that included blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and the risk, if the dose was not carefully controlled, of the systemic absorption of enough atropine to cause serious harm. Cleopatra, the last Ptolemaic queen of Egypt, who died in 30 BCE, is reported by classical sources to have used extracts from the related plant Egyptian henbane, Hyoscamus muticus, for the same cosmetic purpose, dilating her pupils to enhance the appearance of her eyes in the elaborate courts ceremonies and diplomatic encounters that defined her extraordinary and ultimately tragic reign, a detail that connects the ancient Egyptian world to the Renaissance Italian one across 15 centuries through the shared logic of beauty and the shared willingness to employ potent botanical compounds in its service. The plant is referenced in the Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical document dating to approximately 1550 BCE, making it one of the oldest recorded botanical poisons in human history, and it appears in the mythology of ancient Greece as the plant used by the enchantress Circe, described in Homer's Odyssey, to poison the companions of Odysseus and transform them into animals before Odysseus himself, armed with the protective herb moly given to him by the god Hermes, came to confront her. The active compounds in belladonna, atropine, and scopolamine are tropane alkaloids that act by blocking the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors in the parasympathetic nervous system, producing effects that include dilated pupils, elevated heart rate, dry mouth, difficulty swallowing, flushed skin, confusion, hallucination, and, in sufficient doses, a syndrome of profound physiological disruption that can culminate in respiratory failure and death, a syndrome that physicians in the 19th century came to know by the mnemonic hot as a hare, dry as a bone, red as a beet, blind as a bat, mad as a hatter, a phrase that is still occasionally taught in medical schools, as a reminder of the diagnostic signature of anticholinergic poisoning. The isolation of pure atropine from belladonna was achieved by the German chemist Philipp Lorenz Geiger in 1833, and the development of atropine as a clinical pharmaceutical agent over the following decades represents one of the clearest examples in the history of medicine of how the systematic investigation of a poison can yield a treatment, for atropine is now used in cardiac emergencies, to treat excessively slow heart rates, in anesthesiology to reduce secretions before surgery, and in ophthalmology to dilate the pupils for examination. Each of these applications, a direct descendant of the folk knowledge and the witchcraft, tradition, and the Renaissance cosmetics that preceded it by centuries and millennia. Meanwhile, the witches of early modern Europe who prepared ointments containing belladonna, henbane, and mandrake and applied them to the skin in rituals connected to flight and transformation were, in the analysis of modern pharmacologists, experiencing the very real effects of transdermal absorption of scopolamine and atropine, the sensation of flying that some accounts describe, being a recognized effect of certain tropane alkaloids on perception and vestibular function, a detail that brings a certain reflective quiet to the long history of women who were condemned for their knowledge of these plants, and who possessed, it now seems clear, a pharmacological expertise that their accusers entirely lacked. The mandrake root, Mandragora officinarum, is a plant so deeply embedded in the mythology and the pharmacological history of the Western world that it is sometimes difficult to separate the substance of the legend from the substance of the science. And yet both the legend and the science are, in their own ways, entirely real, and both of them point toward a plant of extraordinary potency and extraordinary cultural resonance that has accompanied human beings through the long centuries of their fear and their wonder, with a consistency that few other botanical subjects can claim. The plant is native to the Mediterranean region and the Middle East, growing in rocky, disturbed soils across southern Europe, the Levant, and the Himalayan foothills, and it produces a rosette of large, dark green leaves that lie flat against the ground, surrounding a cluster of pale purple flowers that give way in autumn to small yellow-orange berries. And beneath all of this, pressing down into the earth, a thick, forking taproot that can grow to the size of a human forearm, and whose forked shape, in specimens of a certain age and development, can acquire a rough resemblance to the form of a human body, the two lower branches suggesting legs, the upper part suggesting a torso and shoulders, an anatomical suggestion that was taken with the utmost seriousness by herbalists and physicians and mythologists across the ancient and medieval world. The ancient Egyptians called it the plant of Circe, attributing to it the same magical and transformative properties that Homer's Enchantress was said to have employed. And the Ebers Papyrus, composed around 1550 BCE, refers to a plant that historians believe is mandrake in the context of preparations designed to induce sleep and anesthesia, making it quite possibly the first recorded botanical anesthetic in human history, a distinction that sits quietly alongside all the darker associations the plant has accumulated across the centuries. The doctrine of signatures, a philosophical system of botanical medicine that held sway across medieval and Renaissance Europe, and which proposed that the physical appearance of a plant indicated the conditions for which it was medicinally suited, led generations of herbalists to conclude that, because the mandrake root resembled a human form, it must have a special and intimate connection to human physiology. A belief that, while scientifically unsound in its premise, had the incidental effect of directing considerable sustained attention toward a plant that did, in fact, contain compounds of genuine pharmacological significance. The active compounds in mandrake are tropane alkaloids, the same general class as those in belladonna, including hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and atropine, concentrated especially in the roots and berries, and producing effects that include sedation, analgesia, hallucination, and anticholinergic toxicity in ways broadly similar to those described in the preceding chapter, though the specific alkaloid ratios differ from species to species and preparation to preparation, making it a plant that resists simple characterization and that rewards careful study. The most famous myth associated with the mandrake root, recorded in versions by Josephus in the 1st century CE, by Pliny the Elder in his Naturalis Historia of 77 CE, and by numerous herbalists of the medieval and Renaissance periods, is the belief that the root, when pulled from the earth, emitted a shriek so devastating that it could kill any human being who heard it, and that the only safe method of harvesting it was to tie one end of a rope to the root and the other end to the leg of a dog, stop one's own ears with wax, and then stand at a sufficient distance and call the dog toward you, so that the dog pulled the root from the earth and died upon hearing its cry, while the harvester survived. A story that is fantastical in its details, but that may preserve a core of practical truth about the dangers of handling a plant whose alkaloids can be absorbed through the skin and whose roots were genuinely hazardous to people who encountered them without understanding what they contained. Shakespeare knew the mandrake well, and his references to it in plays including Othello, Romeo and Juliet, and Antony and Cleopatra suggest that an educated Elizabethan audience would have recognized the allusion immediately and understood its pharmacological implications, for the mandrake appears in his work consistently as a symbol of deep, unnatural sleep, of the boundary between consciousness and oblivion. and of the perilous overlap between medicine and magic that characterized the botanical knowledge of his era. The use of mandrake as a surgical anesthetic is documented in the writings of Dioscorides, the Greek physician of the 1st century CE, whose work De Materia Medica became the foundational pharmacological text of the Western world, revised and republished over 15 centuries of European medical practice, in which he describes how wine in which mandrake root had been steeped could be administered before surgery or cauterization to produce a state of insensibility in which the patient would neither feel pain nor form lasting memories of the procedure, a description of what we would now call general anesthesia that predates the use of ether by more than 1700 years. Meanwhile, across the Islamic world, physicians of the Abbasid Caliphate period, including Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, who completed his great medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, around 1025 CE, described mandrake preparations with clinical precision and recommended them for pain management, sleep disorders, and the reduction of anxiety before surgical procedures, situating the plant within a tradition of rational medicine that ran alongside, and sometimes in tension with the magical tradition of the Western herbalists. And that contributed materially to the pharmacological knowledge that was eventually transmitted back to Europe during the Renaissance. The mandrake root, then, is a plant that contains in itself the entire paradox of botanical toxicology. The same root that could kill a dog was the root that allowed a medieval surgeon to operate without causing agony, and the distance between those two outcomes is measured, as Paracelsus would have understood perfectly, entirely in the matter of dose. Strychnine, derived from the seeds of Strychnos nux vomica, a tree native to the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, represents a significant departure in our survey from the plants we have considered thus far, for the toxin it contains works not by suppressing the nervous system, but by an almost opposite mechanism, by removing the natural brakes on neurological activity and allowing the entire motor system to fire in catastrophic, uncontrolled waves of contraction that are among the most physiologically violent events that the human body can be made to undergo by any chemical means, natural or synthetic. Strychnos nux vomica is a medium-sized deciduous tree whose flat, button-shaped seeds, encased in a hard shell within a soft orange-red fruit, contain strychnine and brucine in concentrations sufficient to produce severe toxicity in human beings from doses measured in milligrams. And the tree grows across a wide belt of tropical and subtropical Asia, including India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and northern Australia, where it has been known and used by traditional medical practitioners for centuries under various local names, the Sanskrit name Kuchila appearing in Ayurvedic texts of the early medieval period as a remedy for conditions including paralysis, which reflects a folk knowledge of the plant's stimulant effects on the nervous system that was correct in its general observation, even if the underlying mechanism was not understood in modern chemical terms. The Spanish navigator and explorer Francisco Hernandez, who was sent to New Spain in 1570 by King Philip II of Spain to investigate the medical plants of the Americas, documented the use of various species of strychnos by indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and Central America, and it was from related species of the genus that the indigenous peoples of the Amazon basins prepared curare, the arrow poison that would become profoundly significant in the history of both toxicology and surgery, which we will arrive at in due course. Strychnine was first isolated in pure form in 1818 by the French chemists Pierre-Joseph Pelletier and Joseph Bien-Aimé Caventou, who also isolated quinine, brucine, and several other alkaloids in the same period of extraordinary productivity, working in the laboratories of the École de Pharmacie in Paris and publishing their results in the Annales de Chimie et de Physique. And their isolation of strychnine was a landmark achievement of early organic chemistry that opened the way for the systematic study of plant alkaloids as a class of chemical compounds. The mechanism by which strychnine exerts its terrible effect was not fully elucidated until the 20th century, when neurochemical research revealed that it acts as a competitive antagonist of glycine, the principal inhibitory neurotransmitter in the spinal cord and brainstem, blocking the glycine receptors that normally prevent motor neurons from firing, unless instructed to do so, with the result that sensory stimuli of any kind, a sound, a touch, a change in light, trigger waves of simultaneous muscle contraction throughout the body, producing the characteristic posture of opisthotonus, in which the spine arches backward with such force that only the head and heels remain in contact with the surface beneath the patient, a posture that the ancient Greeks called the arc of death, and that physicians of the 19th century described in clinical reports with a careful restraint that nonetheless communicates the profound distress of what they were witnessing. In the latter half of the 19th century, strychnine occupied a peculiar position in the pharmacological landscape of Britain, the United States, and Europe, being simultaneously recognized as a potentially lethal poison and widely available in small doses, as a tonic and stimulant, included in proprietary medicines marketed for conditions including digestive weakness, nervous exhaustion, and general debility, and administered by physicians who believed, with some supporting evidence, that very low doses could strengthen the contractions of smooth muscle and improve gastric function. The criminal history of strychnine is extensive and spans well over a century, beginning with its use in the poisoning of Thomas Griffiths Wainwright, the English artist and writer who was suspected of several poisonings in the 1820s and 1830s, though never convicted of them, and including the notorious case of Thomas Neal Cream, a physician and serial killer who was hanged in London in 1892 for the murder of several women using strychnine obtained through his medical access, and culminating in numerous 20th century cases that demonstrate the compound's persistent availability and persistent misuse across generations. The Italian-American physician Harvey Wiley, who served as chief chemist of the United States Department of Agriculture from 1883 to 1912, and who was instrumental in the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, conducted experiments in the early 1900s using a group of volunteer government clerks who became known in the press as the Poison Squad, investigating the safety of various food additives, including small quantities of strychnine, an experiment that by modern ethical standards would be entirely impermissible, but that contributed to the growing body of evidence that a number of substances then in common use were more harmful than had been acknowledged. The 20th century saw the use of strychnine decline sharply as its mechanisms became better understood, and as more targeted pharmaceuticals replaced the tonic preparations in which it had been an ingredient, and it is now used primarily as a rodenticide, a use that has itself become controversial in many jurisdictions because of its effects on non-target animals, including birds of prey and domestic pets that may consume poisoned rodents, a problem that illustrates the persistent ecological complexity of botanical toxins when they are removed from their natural context and inserted into human systems of pest management. And yet the strychnos tree continues to grow quietly in the forests of India and Southeast Asia, producing its seeds with the unhurried indifference of a living organism that has no awareness of the vast and troubled human story that has accumulated around it across the centuries. Curare, the name given to a family of arrow poisons, prepared from various species of the genus Strychnos and Chondrodendron by indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin and other regions of South America, is one of the most remarkable examples in all of botanical history of a substance that was first encountered by outsiders as an instrument of warfare and death, and was subsequently transformed through the patient work of pharmacologists across 3 centuries into one of the most important tools of modern surgery, a transformation that mirrors in compressed form the broader narrative of botanical toxicology, and that deserves to be traced with care and with the recognition that the knowledge at its origin belonged to people whose intellectual achievement in understanding and manipulating the chemistry of their environment was extraordinary by any standard. The word curare comes from a South American indigenous language, likely from the Carib or Tupi linguistic family, and refers to a preparation that was applied to the tips of blowpipe darts and arrows, causing a rapid onset paralysis in animals struck by them that made hunting far more efficient in the dense forest environment of the Amazon, where a wounded animal that fled could quickly become inaccessible, and the preparation was made through processes that varied between different indigenous groups, but generally involved the boiling and concentration of bark and root extracts from one or more species of liana vine, combined in some preparations with the secretions of poison dart frogs and other botanical materials, over many hours of labor to produce a thick, dark paste of considerable potency. The first sustained European account of curare was provided by the Spanish explorer and historian Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés, who described the arrow poisons of the Caribbean indigenous peoples in his Historia General y Natural de las Indias, published in 1535, and subsequent accounts were provided by Sir Walter Raleigh in his 1595 narrative of his exploration of Guiana by the French naturalist Charles Marie de la Condamine, who brought samples of curare back to Europe from his expedition to the Amazon in the 1740s and presented them to the Académie des Sciences in Paris, and by the German explorer Alexander von Humboldt, whose detailed account of the preparation of curare by the Orinoco indigenous peoples, published in his personal narrative of travels to the equinoctial regions of the new continent in the early 19th century, provided European scientists with enough information to begin systematic chemical investigation. The principal active compound in the most pharmacologically significant form of curare, prepared from Chondrodendron tomentosum, is tubocurarine, an alkaloid that acts as a competitive antagonist of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, blocking the receptors on muscle cells that normally receive the signal to contract and producing a flaccid paralysis that begins with the small muscles of the face and eyes and progresses to the larger muscles of the limbs and trunk, and ultimately the diaphragm, a progression that is essentially the reverse of strychnine poisoning, and that is, without respiratory support, fatal for the same reason. The English physiologist Benjamin Brodie conducted some of the first systematic experiments on the mechanism of curare in the early 19th century, maintaining a cat under artificial ventilation by bellows while it was under the influence of the poison, and demonstrating that the heart continued to beat and the animal remained alive as long as breathing was maintained, a result that would prove to have profound implications for the eventual clinical use of Cura compounds as muscle relaxants in surgery, though that application lay more than a century in the future. The Canadian physician Harold Randall Griffith and his resident Enid Johnson administered tubocurin clinically for the first time as a surgical muscle relaxant on January 23, 1942, at the Homeopathic Hospital in Montreal, using a preparation of purified tubocurin supplied by the pharmaceutical company E.R. Squibb and Sons under the trade name Intercostrin, and the success of that procedure inaugurated the modern era of balanced anesthesia, in which patients can be rendered immobile with small doses of muscle relaxant, without requiring the deep levels of anesthetic that had previously been necessary to prevent movement during surgery, a development that reduced the risks of general anesthesia enormously, and that saved, in the decades that followed, an incalculable number of lives. The story of how an arrow poison, known to the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, became the foundation of modern anesthetic practice is one that involves the systematic appropriation of indigenous botanical knowledge by European and North American scientists who did not always acknowledge the origins of what they were building upon, a dimension of the history that has attracted increasing scholarly attention since the latter decades of the 20th century, and that is worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet contemplation that an hour like this one invites before we continue. Meanwhile, the synthetic compounds developed in the mid-20th century to replace tubocurin, including pancuronium, vecuronium, and succinylcholine, now fill the drug cabinets of operating theaters around the world, each of them a chemical descendant of the Amazonian liana vine, each of them a tribute to the sustained intelligence of the people who first understood what that vine could do and found a way to deploy that understanding in the service of survival. The contrast between the arrow tip and the anesthetic vial is, in its quiet way, one of the most profound in all of pharmacological history, and it asks us to think carefully about what we mean when we distinguish between a poison and a medicine, and to consider whether that distinction is one of chemistry or of intention. Castor beans, the seeds of Ricinus communis, present us with a botanical toxin of extraordinary potency and considerable historical and scientific complexity, for the castor plant is simultaneously one of the most widely cultivated crop plants in the world, its oil extracted on an industrial scale for use in lubricants, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and the preparation of biodiesel, and the source of ricin, a protein-based toxin that is considered by toxicologists to be among the most lethal, naturally occurring substances known, with an estimated lethal dose in human beings, measured in micrograms per kilogram of body weight, a quantity so small that it is genuinely difficult to conceptualize in ordinary terms, which may be one reason why ricin has attracted, alongside the castor plant's entirely benign agricultural uses, such persistent and troubling interest from those with violent intentions. Ricinus communis is a tropical plant of African origin that has been cultivated across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and South Asia for at least 6,000 years, with archaeological evidence of castor seeds and oil found at sites in ancient Egypt dating to approximately 4000 BCE, and it appears in the Ebers Papyrus as a medicinal plant used as a laxative, and for the treatment of skin conditions, with Egyptian physicians apparently aware, as their successors in many traditions would also be, that the oil pressed from the seeds was largely free of the toxic protein, while the raw seeds themselves were deeply dangerous, a distinction that reflects a sophisticated, practical knowledge of the plant's chemistry achieved entirely without the conceptual framework of modern biochemistry. The Roman physician Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described the castor plant under the name ricinus, the Latin word for tick, which he applied to the plant because the seeds, with their mottled brown and white markings, and their oval shape, reminded him of the engorged body of a wood tick. And he noted that while the oil was used medicinally and cosmetically, the seeds themselves were known to be poisonous, a fact that was sufficiently well established in the ancient Mediterranean world to appear in a general encyclopedia of natural history without any particular emphasis or alarm. Ricin is not an alkaloid, but a ribosome inactivating protein, a large and complex molecule consisting of 2 chains. A binding chain that attaches the toxin to the surface of cells, and an active chain that, once inside the cell, attacks the ribosomes, the molecular machines responsible for manufacturing proteins, and inactivates them irreversibly, halting protein synthesis and causing cell death in a cascade that, depending on the dose and the route of exposure, can affect virtually every organ system in the body, producing a syndrome that unfolds over 1 to 4 days, and that has no specific antidote in current clinical practice. The toxicity of ricin was first investigated scientifically by the German chemist Peter Hermann Stillmark, who isolated the compound in 1888 as part of his doctoral research at the University of Dorpat, now Tartu in Estonia, demonstrating that a small quantity of extract from castor beans was capable of killing a rabbit and of agglutinating, meaning clumping together, red blood cells in a test tube. Observations that laid the foundation for the eventual understanding of ricin as a lectin, a class of proteins with specific binding affinities for carbohydrate structures on cell surfaces. The most famous use of ricin as an instrument of assassination occurred on September 7, 1978, on Waterloo Bridge in London, when a Bulgarian dissident and writer named Georgy Markov, who had defected from communist Bulgaria in 1969 and was working as a broadcaster for the BBC World Service and Radio Free Europe, was jabbed in the right thigh by the tip of an umbrella wielded by an unknown assailant while he was waiting for a bus, and experienced a sharp stinging pain at the point of contact that he initially dismissed as a minor inconvenience, falling ill within hours and dying 3 days later in a London hospital, where a post-mortem examination revealed a tiny platinum pellet, approximately 1.7 millimeters in diameter, drilled with 2 holes, embedded in the tissues of his thigh and containing a quantity of ricin estimated at approximately 450 micrograms, a quantity so small as to be invisible to the naked eye, and yet sufficient, in this most intimate of deliveries, to end a human life. The case of Georgy Markov, which became known to British intelligence as the Umbrella Murder, was investigated by Scotland Yard in collaboration with the British intelligence services, and while the assailant was never publicly identified or brought to trial, the case is widely attributed to an operation carried out by the Bulgarian Secret Service, the Dazhavna Sigurnost, in collaboration with the Soviet KGB, and it stands as one of the most remarkable instances in the Cold War history of the use of a botanical toxin as an instrument of state power. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw a number of attempted uses of ricin by individuals with varying degrees of technical knowledge and varying motivations, including several cases in the United States and Europe that were investigated by federal law enforcement agencies, none of which resulted in successful mass casualties, in part because the extraction of ricin in a form suitable for weaponization is considerably more technically demanding than the instructions circulating in certain online communities would suggest, and in part because the conditions required for effective delivery of the toxin to a human target are difficult to achieve outside of the highly specific circumstances of the Markov case. Castor oil itself, produced by pressing the seeds under heat or using solvent extraction, is largely free of ricin because the protein is not soluble in oil and remains in the seed cake after pressing, a fact that has allowed the castor plant to maintain its enormous agricultural and industrial importance alongside its reputation as the source of one of the most acutely toxic naturally occurring substances known to science. And so the castor plant stands in our garden, at a place very near the darkest end of the spectrum. Its tall stems and palmate leaves entirely ordinary in appearance. Its seeds mottled and smooth in the hand, its oil clear and odorless in a bottle on a pharmacy shelf. And none of these appearances communicating, without specific knowledge, the extraordinary chemistry that lies within. Abrus precatorius, known in various parts of the world as the rosary pea, the jequirity bean, the crab's eye, and a number of other names that reflect its long and wide distribution across tropical regions of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, contains a toxin called abrin that is structurally and mechanistically very similar to ricin, belonging to the same class of ribosome inactivating proteins, and working by essentially the same cellular mechanism, and which is in some assessments even more potent than ricin by mass, though the precise comparison of their lethal doses is complicated by variations in experimental conditions and the specific forms and routes of exposure involved. And historians and toxicologists sometimes note that the debate over which of these two proteins is the more lethal is conducted with a certain professional detachment that belies the gravity of what is being discussed. The rosary pea is a climbing vine with small, oval leaflets and clusters of pink to purple flowers that give way in the dry season to pods containing the seeds that give the plant most of its common names, seeds that are among the most visually striking of any toxic plant, being a brilliant scarlet red over most of their surface with a jet black spot. At the point where they were attached to the pod, a combination of colors that has made them, across cultures and centuries, objects of considerable aesthetic interest and one of the most widely used natural beads in the world, strung into necklaces, bracelets, rosaries, and decorative objects that have been traded and given as gifts across the Indian Ocean world and the Caribbean for many centuries, a fact that creates a persistent and somewhat unsettling intersection between ornament and danger. The use of jequirity seeds in traditional medicine across South and Southeast Asia and the Caribbean is documented in ethnobotanical literature going back several centuries, with preparations made from the seeds used for conditions including eye inflammation, skin infections, and as a means of inducing abortion, uses that reflect a practical pharmacological knowledge of the plant's properties, employed at doses carefully modulated in the traditional context to achieve therapeutic effects without lethal ones, a calibration that required the kind of accumulated empirical knowledge that is built up over generations rather than derived from first principles. The British physician Charles Robert Richet, whose name is better remembered in connection with his Nobel Prize-winning work on anaphylaxis in 1913, conducted early experiments on the toxic properties of abrin in the 1890s, contributing to the emerging scientific understanding of this class of plant proteins. At a time when the boundaries between immunology, toxicology, and what would become biochemistry were still being drawn. The seeds of the rosary pea were used in India as a means of homicide and suicide for centuries before being analyzed by Western scientists, and their use is documented in medico-legal literature from the British colonial period, with cases reported by physicians of the Indian Medical Service in the latter half of the 19th century that describe the clinical picture of aberrant poisoning in patients who had ingested the seeds, typically presenting after a delay of 1 to 3 days with symptoms including burning of the mouth, nausea, intense abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea, and progressive multi-organ failure, a progression that is deeply sorrowful to trace in the dry language of the colonial medical report. A particular hazard associated with the rosary pea that has received attention in the modern occupational health literature is the risk of poisoning associated with the manufacture of jewelry from the seeds. For workers who pierce the seeds by hand with needles have been documented to develop aberrant poisoning when small scratches in their fingers allowed the toxin from the seed interior to enter the bloodstream, a route of exposure so subtle and so unexpected that it illustrates in the most precise way how botanical toxins can work at the margins of human awareness, in the gap between what appears safe and what is actually dangerous. The bright red and black coloration of the rosary pea seed is understood by evolutionary biologists as an example of aposematism, the use of vivid, contrasting colors as a warning signal to potential predators, a strategy employed across the animal and plant kingdoms by organisms that have developed chemical defenses and benefit from advertising those defenses visually rather than having to deploy them repeatedly. And it is one of the more thought-provoking aspects of the plant's natural history that its most dangerous attribute, the toxicity of its seeds, is communicated in a visual language that human beings found beautiful rather than cautionary, incorporating the warning signal into their ornamental traditions without fully registering its original intention. The global distribution of the rosary pea, accelerated by maritime trade routes that carried the seeds as incidental cargo in ballast and in the goods of merchants crossing the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, means that the plant now grows as an introduced and often invasive species across tropical and subtropical regions of the Americas, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa and Australia, a botanical migration that has proceeded at the pace of human commerce. And that reflects quietly the way in which the human tendency to find things beautiful and to carry them along has spread the most potent and the most gentle members of the plant kingdom alike into corners of the world where they did not evolve. As we sit now at the very edge of the darkest part of our garden, the air has grown very still, and the plants around us are simply themselves, neither malevolent nor benign, but simply possessed of a chemistry that took millions of years to develop, and that intersects with human biology in ways that range from the mildly inconvenient to the most final of consequences. Aconitine, which we encountered earlier in its natural context, as the active compound of the monkshood plant, returns now in this later chapter, not to be reintroduced, but to be contemplated more carefully, because it represents something worth dwelling on as we approach the outermost edge of the botanical toxicity spectrum, which is the way in which the most acutely lethal plant compounds are not necessarily the most obscure or the most exotic, but are sometimes found in plants that grow in the temperate meadows and mountain slopes of the ordinary world, in places where hikers pass, and gardeners plant and children wander, which is a thought worth holding gently before we pass to the final plant in our survey, the death camas, Anticlea elegans, and related species of the genus Zygodanus, grows across the prairies and mountain meadows of North America, and contains steroidal alkaloids of considerable potency that have caused the deaths of sheep, cattle, horses, and human beings, for as long as records have been kept in the regions where it grows. And it is a plant that bears in its early growth stage a close visual resemblance to the wild onion, Allium canadense, with which it sometimes grows in close proximity, a resemblance that has been the source of many accidental poisonings among both humans and livestock across the centuries, and that accounts for a significant proportion of the plant poisoning cases reported in the western United States to this day. The water hemlock, which appeared briefly in an earlier chapter, deserves here a fuller consideration, for Cicuta douglasii and Cicuta maculata, the two principal North American species, grow in the wet margins of streams, ditches, and ponds throughout the continent. Their white umbel flowers and hollow stems, and the distinctive chamber structure of their roots, making them identifiable to the botanist, but not always to the casual forager. And the cytotoxin they contain acts on the central nervous system by blocking GABA receptors, removing the inhibitory influence on the brain's excitatory circuits, and causing violent and sustained convulsions that are often described by historians of plant toxicology as among the most acute and rapid of any natural toxin, with death reported in some cases within 15 minutes of ingestion of a significant portion of the root. The physician and botanist Jacob Bigelow, writing in his American Medical Botany, published between 1817 and 1820, described water hemlock as the most violently toxic plant of North America, a judgment that has been echoed by subsequent generations of toxicologists, and that reflects the specific nature of cytotoxin's action, which, unlike many plant poisons, does not produce a gradual descent into unconsciousness or a quiet failure of systems, but rather a sudden and overwhelming seizure that is deeply distressing to witness, and that requires immediate medical intervention if the patient is to survive. Taxine, the active compound of the yew tree, Taxus baccata, belongs to a category of plant toxins that operates through the cardiovascular system, disrupting the normal flow of calcium and sodium into cardiac muscle cells and causing the electrical conduction of the heart to fail in a manner that can progress very rapidly from normal cardiac function to complete cardiac arrest. And the yew is unusual among the plants we have discussed, in that its toxicity is distributed across almost all of its parts: the bark, the wood, the needles, and the seeds, with the notable exception of the bright red flesh of the aril, the cup-shaped structure that surrounds the seed, which is the only part of the plant free of taxine, and which birds eat without harm as part of the plant's seed dispersal strategy. The yew has been woven into the cultural and spiritual landscape of Europe for a very long time, planted in churchyards across Britain and Ireland since at least the early medieval period, associated with immortality and with the boundary between the living and the dead in the Celtic and Germanic traditions, and growing to ages that can exceed 2,000 years, making individual yew trees in English churchyards among the oldest living organisms in Europe, their great gnarled trunks and pendulous branches presiding over generations of burials, with the indifferent longevity of things that are simply very old and very still. Julius Caesar, in his account of the Gallic Wars, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, written in the 50s BCE, described a Gaulish chieftain named Catavolcus, who chose death by yew poisoning rather than submission to Roman authority, a passage that positions the yew at the intersection of political resistance and botanical knowledge that runs through so much of the history of poisonous plants, the knowledge of the plant being itself a form of power, a means of determining one's own end in a world that otherwise permits very little such determination. The final movement of our survey brings us to reflect, in this quiet moment before sleep, that the botanical world does not recognize the categories of poison and medicine, of danger and beauty, of ancient and modern, that human beings have imposed upon it across the long centuries of their cohabitation with the plant kingdom, and that every compound we have traced this evening, from the mild solanine in a tomato leaf to the ricin in a castor seed, was produced by a living organism for reasons entirely unrelated to human beings, as a defense against insects, as a deterrent to browsing mammals, as a component of the plant's own metabolic processes, and that the entire human history of poison and pharmacology is, from the plant's perspective, simply the story of what happened when one species with curious hands and inquiring minds began to investigate the chemistry of another kingdom entirely, and found, in that investigation, both the instruments of death and the tools of healing, sometimes in the same leaf, and sometimes in the same molecule, and sometimes, as Paracelsus knew, and as the whole long history of this subject confirms, separated from one another by nothing more substantial than the careful measure of a dose. And so the garden grows quiet again. In the late hours, the moonlight falling softly across the monkshood and the belladonna, across the foxglove and the yew, across the rosary pea with its beautiful and dangerous seeds. And all of it is simply still, and all of it is simply chemistry, and all of it is part of the long, slow story of the living world. A story that has been unfolding for hundreds of millions of years without hurry and without urgency and without any particular interest in being finished, which makes it, in its own way, a perfect companion for the small hours of the night, when sleep has not yet come and the mind needs something vast and ancient and unhurried to rest itself against. There is a particular quality to the silence that settles over a garden in the deepest part of the night, a silence that is not empty but full of the slow respiration of leaves, the movement of water through stems, the patient chemistry of roots pressing into the dark soil. And it is in this quality of fullness that the plants we turn to now find their most appropriate context, for we have arrived at a region of our spectrum where the compounds involved are so potent and the history of their human entanglement so layered with consequence, that the most respectful thing we can do is to approach them slowly with the kind of attention that the hour and the subject both deserve. Veratrum album, the white hellebore, is a plant of the lily family that grows in the alpine meadows of Europe and Western Asia, its tall stems bearing broad, deeply ribbed leaves and clusters of small white flowers, its roots and rhizomes containing a complex mixture of steroidal alkaloids, including protoveratrine, jervine, and cyclopamine, that act on voltage-gated sodium channels in a manner that causes an initial violent stimulation of the nervous and cardiovascular systems, followed by a profound depression of both, a sequence of effects that can move very rapidly from severe discomfort to life-threatening crisis. The plant was known to the physicians of ancient Greece, appearing in the Hippocratic corpus as a remedy for conditions including madness, epilepsy, and melancholy, used in doses so carefully titrated that the administration of white hellebore was considered a test of the physician's skill, for too little produced no effect, and too much produced catastrophe. and the physician who navigated the narrow channel between these two outcomes successfully was regarded with considerable professional respect by his contemporaries. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, reported that the physician Callisthenes used hellebore in the treatment of the Macedonian soldiers before the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, administering it as a purge to clear the intestines and improve the soldiers' fitness for combat. An account that, whether entirely accurate in its details or not, reflects the deep integration of this potent plant into the military and medical culture of the ancient Greek world. Protoveratrine, the principal alkaloid responsible for the cardiac effects of white hellebore, was investigated extensively by pharmacologists in the mid-20th century as a potential treatment for hypertension, and clinical trials conducted in the 1940s and 1950s showed that it was indeed effective at lowering blood pressure, but the therapeutic window was so narrow. The margin between the dose that was beneficial and the dose that caused severe bradycardia, nausea, and cardiovascular collapse so uncomfortably small that the drug was eventually abandoned in favor of safer antihypertensive agents as those became available. A decision that reflects the broader movement in 20th century pharmacology, away from the complex, variable natural extracts toward the more predictable synthetic compounds. Cyclopamine, another alkaloid from Veratrum californicum, the American false hellebore, was discovered to have teratogenic effects, meaning effects that interfere with normal fetal development, in a series of studies conducted in the 1950s and 1960s by the American veterinarian Lynn Binns, who was investigating an epidemic of cyclopia, a severe birth defect in which the face develops with a single central eye, in the lambs of sheep grazing on Idaho rangelands, an investigation that eventually traced the cause to ewes eating the false hellebore during a critical period of early pregnancy, and whose findings, decades later, proved to be the key to understanding a molecular pathway involved in the development of certain cancers, leading to the development of a class of anti-cancer drugs called hedgehog pathway inhibitors, a chain of scientific consequence that runs from a field of sheep in Idaho to the oncology wards of modern hospitals through the quiet mediation of an alpine plant. The medieval herbalists of Europe used preparations of black hellebore, Helleborus nuniger, a plant of an entirely different genus that shares a name through the vagaries of historical botanical nomenclature, as a remedy for madness and melancholy, a use recorded by Pliny the Elder and by the physicians of the Galenic tradition, and the plant takes its common name, Christmas rose, from its habit of flowering in the depths of winter, its white blooms emerging from the snow in a manner that struck medieval observers as both beautiful and somehow uncanny, as though the plant existed outside the normal rules of the seasonal world. The alkaloids of the true hellebores, the genus Helleborus, are distinct from those of Veratrum, but similarly capable of causing serious cardiac and neurological effects, and the plant was mentioned in the writings of the 16th century German botanist Leonhard Fuchs in his landmark Herbal de Historia Stirpium of 154, 2, a work that combined the classical tradition with direct botanical observation, and that contributed materially to the transformation of herbalism into something approaching what we would now recognize as systematic botany. Over the following centuries, the hellebores in all their forms remained a fixture of the European apothecary's cabinet, their toxicity managing to coexist with their therapeutic applications. Through a combination of empirical caution and the kind of practical wisdom that accumulates in a tradition slowly, through the observation of outcomes rather than the understanding of mechanisms, a way of knowing that is slower and less certain than modern pharmacology. But that was, in its time, the best available approximation of safety. The story of the hellebores is, in this sense, a story of the human capacity to live with uncertainty, to work at the edge of knowledge with imperfect tools and incomplete understanding, and to continue, despite the risks, because the alternative of abandoning the attempt to heal was not, in any era of human history, a tolerable option. Podophyllum peltatum, the mayapple, is a plant of the eastern woodlands of North America, whose cheerful common name and familiar spring appearance, the umbrella-like leaves and waxy white flowers of the forest floor, conceal a toxicological profile of considerable seriousness, and whose active compounds, the podophyllotoxins, have traveled a path from indigenous medicine to frontier pharmacology, to modern oncology that is as long and as winding as any in our survey. The mayapple is a perennial herb that spreads through the eastern deciduous forests of North America by means of underground rhizomes, forming large colonies of plants, whose single stalked leaf or paired leaves and solitary white flower are a familiar sight in the spring woodland understory from Nova Scotia to Texas. And while the ripe yellow fruit is edible and was eaten by various indigenous peoples of the region, the roots, the leaves, the stems, and the unripe fruit contain resin-like compounds of significant toxicity that were used medicinally by numerous indigenous groups, including the Cherokee, the Iroquois, and the Penobscot, who employed root preparations as a cathartic, a treatment for intestinal parasites, and in some traditions, as a means of inducing abortion. The European and American physicians who began to systematically investigate the mayapple in the 19th century found that the active fraction of the root resin, which came to be called podophyllin, had a remarkable effect on the growth of rapidly dividing cells, interfering with the process of cell division by binding to tubulin, the protein from which the spindle fibers that separate chromosomes during mitosis are constructed, and preventing those fibers from forming correctly, an effect that was deeply harmful to normal tissues in excessive doses, but that suggested a possible application in the treatment of conditions characterized by abnormally rapid cell division. The American physician John Uri Lloyd and his brother Curtis Gates Lloyd, who operated a pharmaceutical manufacturing company in Cincinnati from the 1880s onward, and who published extensively on the pharmacology of indigenous North American plant medicines, contributed to the early clinical investigation of podophyllin as a treatment for venereal warts and certain skin conditions, work that established a tradition of clinical use that persisted into the 20th century. Semi-synthetic derivatives of podophyllotoxin, developed by chemists in the mid-20th century, eventually yielded the anti-cancer drugs etoposide and teniposide, both of which are now used in the treatment of a range of malignancies, including small cell lung cancer, testicular cancer, and certain lymphomas, and which work by a mechanism slightly different from podophyllotoxin itself, inhibiting the enzyme topoisomerase II, rather than blocking tubulin assembly, though the connection to the original plant compound is direct and acknowledged in the scientific literature. The story of how a woodland plant that indigenous peoples of North America had been using medicinally for centuries became the basis of chemotherapy, drugs that are in routine clinical use around the world, is one that has been told with increasing care in recent decades, with scholars of the history of medicine drawing attention to the gap between the appropriation of indigenous botanical knowledge and the recognition and compensation of the communities from whom that knowledge was taken. A gap that remains, as of the early 21st century, largely unaddressed at the institutional level, despite the considerable economic value of the drugs involved. The broader pattern here, which recurs across the history of plant-derived pharmaceuticals, from curare to quinine to the rosy periwinkle of Madagascar, is one in which the intellectual labor of indigenous botanical knowledge serves as the foundation for the commercial and scientific edifices of Western pharmaceutical development, a pattern that the historian Londa Schiebinger has traced in detail in her work on the relationship between colonialism and the natural history of the Americas. And that casts a long shadow over the triumphalist narratives of medical progress that have sometimes been told around these discoveries. The mayapple itself continues to grow in the eastern woodlands, its colonies expanding slowly through the leaf litter of spring, indifferent to the uses to which its chemistry has been put, flowering and fruiting according to its own ancient rhythms, which have not changed because of anything that human beings have found within it. The oleander we visited earlier in our survey returns now, in a different form, not as a garden shrub to be observed with gentle caution, but as the gateway to a consideration of the broader family of cardiac glycoside-containing plants that includes not only Nerium oleander, but the African species Acocanthera skimperi, whose wood and bark were used by the Maasai, the Kamba, and other pastoral and hunter-gatherer peoples of East Africa as the source of ouabain, a cardiac glycoside of extraordinary potency applied to the tips of hunting arrows, in a preparation known as waistband, used in the hunting of large game, including elephant, giraffe, and buffalo, and whose history intersects with one of the most remarkable passages in the science of cardiac pharmacology. Ouabain, extracted from Acocanthera skimperi and from the seeds of Strophanthus gratus, a West African liana vine, was brought to the attention of European scientists by the British explorer and physician William Balfour Beatty in the 1850s, and its properties were subsequently investigated by the Scottish physician Thomas Richard Fraser, who published his seminal study of the Strophanthus plants in 1890, demonstrating that the active compound had a rapid and powerful effect on the heart and suggesting its potential use as an emergency cardiac medication in cases where the slower-acting digitalis preparations were insufficient. The German Nobel laureate Jens Christian Schau, whose 1997 Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded for his discovery of the sodium-potassium ATPase enzyme, the very enzyme that cardiac glycosides, including ouabain, inhibit, used ouabain as a key experimental tool in his investigations during the 1950s and 1960s, a fact that connects the hunting poisons of the East African grasslands to the most fundamental discoveries of modern cellular biology through the unbroken thread of a chemical compound that moves from an Acocanthera tree to an arrow to a British explorer's specimen case to a Danish biochemist's laboratory bench. The foxglove, which we considered at length in an earlier chapter, belongs to this same family of cardiac glycoside-containing plants. And it is worth noting now, from the vantage point of a later chapter, how the entire tradition of cardiac glycoside therapy that William Withering initiated in 1785 rests on the same molecular mechanism as the arrow poison of the Maasai hunter, the same inhibition of the same enzyme, the same disruption of the same cellular process, producing death in the elephant at the end of an arrow, and a somewhat longer life in the patient with congestive heart failure at the end of a carefully measured prescription. The difference between these outcomes being, once again, the measure of the dose and the route of delivery, and the intention of the human being who administers it. The sandthorn, or desert rose, Adenium obesums, a succulent plant of the genus. Adenium that grows across the arid regions of sub-Saharan Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and that has become a popular ornamental plant in tropical and subtropical gardens around the world for its beautiful pink and white flowers, and its swollen, bottle-shaped stem also contains cardiac glycosides, including digitoxygenin and oleandrogenin, and was used as an arrow poison by the San people of southern Africa and by various groups in East Africa. Its sap applied to arrowheads in a preparation that could bring down large game animals relatively quickly. The entire history of arrow poisons across the world's tropical and subtropical regions represents a remarkable convergence of botanical knowledge and practical need, in which communities living in environments rich with both prey and plant diversity developed over many generations of careful and costly experimentation. An understanding of the toxic properties of local plants that allowed them to extend the lethal reach of their weapons far beyond what the mechanical force of the bow or the blowpipe alone could achieve, an achievement of applied chemistry that preceded the formal establishment of chemistry as a scientific discipline by millennia, and that deserves to be recognized as it is increasingly recognized by contemporary historians of science as a genuine intellectual accomplishment of the highest order. The colonial era naturalists and physicians who documented these arrow poison traditions in the 19th century were engaged in a complicated act that was simultaneously genuine scientific inquiry and a dimension of the broader project of colonial knowledge extraction and the question of how to situate their contributions and the contributions of the indigenous peoples from whom they learned within a single narrative of the history of pharmacology is one that has no simple answer, and that the discipline is still working through. As we move now toward the final reaches of our survey, it is worth carrying this complexity with us, because the history of the most toxic plants in the world is inseparable from the history of the human communities that knew them best, and any account that separates the chemistry from the culture in the name of clarity loses something that is, in the end, more important than clarity. The gelsamium plant, Gelsamium sempervirens, known commonly as yellow jessamine or Carolina jasmine, is the climbing vine native to the southeastern United States and Central America, whose fragrant yellow flowers have made it a beloved ornamental plant across the American South, where it grows along fences and over arbors with an easy grace that gives no outward indication of the compound it contains in its roots and stems and leaves. A compound called gelsamine that acts on the central nervous system with a swiftness and a completeness that places the plant well toward the lethal end of our spectrum, despite the apparent gentleness of its appearance. Gelsamine and the related alkaloids, gelsamacine and sempervirine, act as inhibitors of glycine receptors in a manner broadly similar to strychnine, and the clinical picture of gelsamium poisoning, which has been documented in a number of accidental cases involving the mistaking of the plant's roots for edible species, includes muscle weakness, visual disturbance, difficulty swallowing, and in severe cases, paralysis of the respiratory muscles with death from asphyxia, a progression that echoes the mechanisms of several other plants in our survey, and that reflects the evolutionary convergence of different chemical strategies on the same general approach to predator deterrence. The related species, Gelsemium elegans, native to southern China and Southeast Asia, is known in the traditional medical literature of that region as heartbreak grass, a name that speaks to the rapid and devastating cardiac and respiratory effects of its alkaloids, and it has been used in both traditional medicine and as a means of homicide and suicide in southern China, with cases documented in Chinese medical and forensic literature from the 19th century onward, and with a small number of cases reported in recent decades involving its importation to other countries. The first comprehensive pharmacological investigation of gelsemium was conducted in the mid-19th century by American physicians who were interested in its potential as a treatment for neuralgia, fever, and certain nervous conditions, and it was included in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1863 to 1926, a period during which it was prescribed in carefully controlled doses for conditions including migraine, sciatica, and the pain associated with menstruation, applications that have since been abandoned as the plant's toxicity and the narrow margin of safety of its alkaloids became more clearly understood. The homeopathic tradition, which was established in Europe by the German physician Samuel Hahnemann in the late 18th century, and which spread rapidly across the United States and Britain in the 19th century, adopted gelsemium as one of its primary remedies, using preparations diluted to such an extreme degree that, under the principles of homeopathic pharmacology, no molecule of the original substance could be expected to remain in the final preparation, which placed the homeopathic use of the plant in an entirely different register from the allopathic doses that had caused documented toxicity. And the debate between these two traditions over the proper use of botanicals like gelsemium reflects broader tensions in 19th century medicine between empirical and theoretical approaches to therapeutics that have not entirely resolved themselves in the century and a half since. A case reported in the British Medical Journal in 1983 involved a patient who had purchased a preparation labeled as a Chinese herbal tea from a shop in London and developed severe gelsemium alkaloid poisoning after consuming it, an episode that prompted a brief flurry of regulatory attention to the labeling and sale of imported herbal products. And that illustrates the persistent gap between the traditional knowledge context in which a plant is used safely and the commercial context in which preparations made from it reach consumers with no knowledge of its properties. Gelsemium has attracted scientific attention in the early 21st century as a potential source of compounds with analgesic and anti-cancer properties, with researchers at various institutions investigating the possibility of developing synthetic derivatives of gelsemine that retain the therapeutic properties of the molecule without its toxicity, an approach that reflects the standard modern pharmaceutical strategy of using natural compounds as scaffolds for the design of safer synthetic analogues. The yellow jessamine continues to bloom each February and March across the American South, its flowers opening in the first warmth of late winter along the roadsides and the garden fences, scenting the air with a fragrance that has been celebrated in Southern American poetry and literature for 2 centuries, its beauty and its danger coexisting in the same flowers, the same roots, the same climbing stems, in a relationship that has characterized the most interesting members of the botanical world throughout our entire long survey. The angel's trumpet, Brugmansia, a genus of trees and shrubs native to the Andean regions of South America and closely related to the genus Datura, represents in our survey the point at which botanical toxicity intersects most vividly with altered states of consciousness, with ceremonial and ritual practice, and with the category of experience that the anthropologists of religion have called shamanic, and it approaches that intersection with a complexity and a depth of cultural context that makes it one of the most remarkable subjects in the entire history of ethnobotany. The genus Brugmansia contains 7 species of large-flowered, pendulous-bloomed trees and shrubs, all of them now extinct in the wild, existing only in cultivation, after thousands of years of selection and propagation by Andean peoples who valued them so highly that they maintained them in their gardens and ceremonial spaces. Long after the wild populations had disappeared, a degree of human dependency so complete that it makes Brugmansia perhaps the most thoroughly domesticated toxic plant in the world, a plant that has been shaped by human cultivation far more than it has been shaped by natural selection for at least 3,000 years. The flowers of Brugmansia, which hang downward in the manner that gives the plant its common name, are enormous, reaching lengths of 30 to 50 centimeters in some species, and are produced in a variety of colors, including white, yellow, pink, orange, and red, with a fragrance that is strongest in the evening hours. And that has made the plants prized as ornamentals in subtropical and tropical gardens around the world, where they are grown with varying degrees of awareness of the chemical complexity they contain. The tropane alkaloids of Brugmansia, including scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine, are the same class of compounds found in belladonna, henbane, and mandrake, but they are present in Brugmansia in concentrations that can vary enormously between individual plants, between different parts of the same plant, and between different seasons and growing conditions, a variability that makes the plant deeply unpredictable as a pharmacological agent. And that has been the source of many accidental overdoses among people who prepared preparations from it without understanding that the dose could shift dramatically from one preparation to the next. The use of Brugmansia in ceremonial contexts by Andean peoples, including the Quechua, the Shuar, the Siona, and numerous other groups, has been documented by ethnobotanists, including the American researcher Richard Evans Schultes, who spent decades in the 1940s through the 1980s investigating the psychoactive plants of the Amazon and the Andes, and who described in his landmark work, Plants of the Gods, co-authored with the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, and published in 1979, the elaborate ritual contexts in which Brugmansia preparations were consumed, typically under the supervision of experienced shamans who understood how to manage the effects and how to interpret the visions that resulted. The experience produced by scopolamine and atropine at the concentrations found in Brugmansia preparations is not the clearly bounded, visually vivid experience associated with some other psychoactive plants, but rather a profoundly disorientating delirium that erases the boundary between waking and dreaming in a manner that most users describe retrospectively as deeply disturbing rather than illuminating, which is perhaps why its ceremonial use in most Andean traditions was restricted to specialists with extensive training and was not the kind of broadly shared communal experience that characterized the use of other ceremonial plants in the same cultural contexts. The Spanish colonial authorities, who encountered Brugmansia use in the Andes in the 16th and 17th centuries, viewed it with the deep suspicion that they directed at all indigenous ceremonial practices, and their attempts to suppress it through the instruments of the Inquisition. And colonial law drove the practice underground without eliminating it. A pattern of suppression and persistence that is repeated across the history of indigenous botanical knowledge in the colonial world. In the late 20th century, scopolamine, the principal alkaloid of Brugmansia, became notorious under the street name Burundanga in Colombia and other parts of South America as a drug used in the commission of robbery and assault, the ease with which it could be dissolved in food and drink. Its rapid onset of action and its specific effect on the formation of new memories, making it an instrument of considerable danger in the hands of criminals, leading to public health campaigns and widespread awareness in the regions most affected. The cultivation of Brugmansia as a garden ornamental across the subtropical world proceeds. Meanwhile, largely independently of these histories, in the gardens of people who admire the flowers and the fragrance, and who may or may not be aware of the extraordinary story, spanning continents and centuries, that follows the plant wherever it grows. Datura stramonium, known as Jimson weed, thorn apple, devil's snare, and by many other names, reflecting the breadth of its distribution and the depth of its impression on the cultures that have encountered it, is the plant with which we arrive at the final chapter of our survey, and it brings together in itself almost every themes we have traced across the preceding chapters: the paradox of beauty and danger, the intersection of folk knowledge and formal medicine, the use of botanical toxins in ritual and in crime, the slow transformation of poisons into pharmaceuticals, and the deep, ancient relationship between human beings and the plants that share the world with them, a relationship that is older than any other form of medicine, and that underlies, in ways that are still being traced, virtually everything that Western pharmacology has become. Datura stramonium is an annual plant that grows across the temperate and tropical regions of the world with a vigor and an adaptability that has made it one of the most widely distributed plants on Earth, found on roadsides, in disturbed soils, on the margins of agricultural fields, in vacant lots, and in the untended corners of gardens from North America to Europe, from Africa to Australia. Its large, coarsely toothed leaves and white or pale purple, trumpet-shaped flowers, and spiny seed capsules, recognizable to anyone who has spent time in the outdoors of the temperate world. The plant is now believed to be native to Central America, or possibly the Sonoran desert region of North America, and it was introduced to Europe in the 16th century, where it spread rapidly and attracted the attention of herbalists, physicians, and those who had less wholesome purposes in mind for its tropane alkaloid content, appearing in the herbal literature of the period under various names that reflect the reaction it produced in those who encountered its effects: the Italian datura, the witch's thimble, the devil's apple. The Algonquian peoples of eastern North America used datura in a ceremonial context known as wisokan, in which adolescent boys were administered a preparation of the plant as part of an initiation ritual that was intended to cause them to forget their childhood and emerge as adults, a use that is documented in the accounts of European colonists, including Robert Beverley, who described it in his History and Present State of Virginia, published in 1705, noting that the boys were kept in a state of profound delirium for approximately 18 or 20 days, and that when they recovered, they remembered nothing of their childhood. A description that corresponds precisely with the amnestic effects of high-dose scopolamine. The incident that gave Jimson weed its most familiar common name occurred in 1676 in the colonial Virginia town of Jamestown, from which the plant takes the name that was contracted over generations from Jamestown weed to Jimson weed, when a group of British soldiers sent to suppress Bacon's rebellion gathered and ate the plant, not knowing what it was, and experienced several days of profound anticholinergic delirium, during which they were reported to have engaged in various absurd and disoriented behaviors that the colonial historian Robert Beverley described with a certain bemused restraint, noting that the soldiers were rendered entirely incapable of military service for 11 days, and that when they recovered, they remembered nothing of what had happened, a collective episode of accidental poisoning that passed into the local historical record and eventually into the plant's common name. Datura was used in India under the Sanskrit name Datura in preparations associated with the worship of the god Shiva, who in Hindu mythology is said to have drunk the poisons that arose from the churning of the cosmic ocean, an act of cosmic sacrifice that was echoed in the use of intoxicating plants associated with him in certain devotional contexts. And the plant appears in the Ayurvedic medical tradition as both a medicinal agent used in preparations for conditions including asthma and skin disease, and as a poison capable of incapacitating an enemy when introduced into food or drink. A dual role that is consistent with the plant's pharmacological profile and with the general pattern of plant toxin use across human cultures. The seeds of Datura were used by practitioners of the Thuggi tradition in 19th century India, a criminal and ceremonial brotherhood whose activities were documented and eventually suppressed by the British colonial authorities under the governance of Governor-General Lord William Bentinck in the 1830s, as a means of incapacitating travellers before robbing and killing them, a use that led to the compounds acquiring a particular association with criminal pharmacology in the colonial literature of the period, an association that, as we noted in the preceding chapter, has persisted in the use of scopolamine-based drugs for similar purposes into the 21st century. The 19th century saw datura alkaloids investigated extensively by European and American pharmacologists, with atropine and scopolamine isolated, characterized, and eventually synthesized, entering the medical pharmacopoeia as treatments for conditions ranging from motion sickness to Parkinson's disease, to the reduction of secretions in a transformation that followed the same general pattern as every other botanical toxin we have traced in this survey, and that is, by now, entirely familiar in its broad outlines, while remaining remarkable in each of its specific details. The isolation of scopolamine by the German chemist Ernst Schmidt in 1892, and its subsequent clinical investigation by various European physicians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, represents one of the final chapters in the great 19th century project of extracting and characterizing the active compounds of the traditional plant medicines, a project that had begun with the isolation of morphine from opium by Friedrich Serturner in 1804, and that transformed the entire landscape of Western medicine over the century that followed. As we draw now toward the end of our long and unhurried journey through the botanical world, the garden around us has grown very quiet. The moonlight has shifted its angle across the leaves, and the plants we have visited, from the tomato and the daffodil all the way to the mandrake and the brugmansia and the datura, are simply there, rooted in the earth, exchanging carbon dioxide for oxygen in the slow and ancient chemistry of photosynthesis, entirely indifferent to the vast and complicated human history that has accumulated around them across the millennia. It is worth pausing in this final movement of our survey to consider what the entire arc of the journey we have taken together through the toxic plants of the world reveals about the nature of human knowledge and the nature of the relationship between our species and the botanical world that has surrounded us since before we were recognizably human, a relationship that predates language and writing and formal medicine and all of the institutions through which we now organize our understanding of the world. And that has left its traces in all of those institutions nonetheless. The capacity to distinguish between the edible and the poisonous, between the plant that healed and the plant that harmed, was a survival critical ability for the earliest members of our species. And the accumulation of that knowledge across generations, preserved in the memory of communities, in the practices of healers, in the stories told by elders to the young, represents one of the longest and most continuous threads of human intellectual effort, stretching from the Pleistocene to the present, without interruption, passed from person to person and people to people in a chain of transmission that is as remarkable as any other achievement of human culture. The formal sciences of botany and pharmacology and toxicology that emerged in Europe between the 16th and 19th centuries were built, in every case, on foundations laid by people who came before, by the herbalists and shamans and traditional healers and poisoners and physicians of the ancient and medieval worlds, whose knowledge was empirical rather than theoretical, whose methods were observational rather than experimental, in the formal sense, and whose contributions to the eventual edifice of modern medicine are acknowledged imperfectly, if at all, in the standard accounts of that history. The plants themselves have accompanied all of this human activity with complete indifference, evolving their chemical defenses over millions of years in response to selective pressures that had nothing to do with human beings, and finding themselves, in the recent geological blink of an eye, at the center of a vast human project of chemical investigation and exploitation that has transformed their molecules into medicines and poisons and agricultural tools and subjects of legal regulation and instruments of diplomatic intrigue and ceremonial sacraments and criminal weapons, uses so diverse and so contradictory that no single framework is adequate to contain them all. The ricin in the castor seed, and the taxine in the yew berry, and the aconitine in the monkshood flower, and the scopolamine in the datura pod are, from the plant's perspective, simply molecules that discourage consumption, and is only the particular biology of the human nervous system and cardiovascular system, only the specific architecture of our receptor proteins, and our ion channels, and our ribosomal machinery, that makes these molecules so consequential for us, in ways they are not for the insects against whom they were primarily evolved. There is something that invites contemplation in this asymmetry, in the fact that the most powerful poisons in the plant world are not powerful in any absolute sense, but only in relation to the specific vulnerabilities of the organisms that encounter them, and that the human body, for all its complexity and resilience, is susceptible to modification and disruption by compounds produced by plants in quantities that are, from the plant's perspective, entirely routine and unremarkable. The physician who administers atropine to a patient in cardiac distress, and the poisoner who administered belladonna to an enemy in a Renaissance court, and the teenage girl in 16th century Venice who dilated her pupils with drops of belladonna juice, and the ancient Egyptian physician who used mandrake to anesthetize a patient before surgery, are all, in different ways, working with the same molecules in the same biochemical territory, exploring the same narrow and consequential space, where chemistry becomes biology and biology becomes the lived experience of a human being whose heart beats and whose lungs breathe and whose consciousness flickers in the darkness. The history of toxic plants is, in this sense, also a history of the human body a history of the gradual and painstaking discovery of what we are made of and how we work, a discovery that has been pursued not only in laboratories but in gardens and forests, and apothecary shops and prison cells and battlefields and ceremonial lodges and operating theatres across the entire span of recorded human time. And that is still, in the 21st century, very far from complete, with new compounds being identified in plants that have never been formally analysed, new mechanisms being elucidated for compounds that have been known for decades, and new therapeutic applications being found for molecules that were first encountered as instruments of harm. The botanical world is, in this sense, an inexhaustible library, a library written not in words but in molecules, a library whose shelves are the tropical forests and the alpine meadows and the temperate woodlands and the desert margins of the world, and whose contents have been read, slowly and incompletely, and sometimes at great cost, by the accumulated intelligence of every human culture that has ever found it necessary to understand the plants that grew around them, which is to say by every human culture that has ever existed. And so we have arrived, unhurriedly and without fanfare, at the far end of the garden, having walked its full length from the tomato leaf and the daffodil bulb through the foxglove and the belladonna and the hemlock and the mandrake and the strychnos and the castor bean and all the others, a long and winding path through the history of the human relationship with botanical chemistry. And what is perhaps most remarkable, standing here at the end of it, is not the danger that the journey has mapped, but the beauty, the persistent, undeniable beauty of the plants themselves, their flowers and their fruits, and their deep roots, and their patient chemistry. All of it evolved over millions of years without any intention that we are aware of. And yet somehow, in the fullness of human time, accumulated into the most consequential pharmacopoeia in the history of medicine. The garden is still now, as all gardens are in the deep of the night, and the moonlight is moving slowly across the leaves, and the plants are breathing in their own quiet way, exchanging gases with the darkness, doing what living things do in the hours when the world is not watching. Every compound we have traced this evening, from the mild solanine of the tomato to the ricin of the castor seed, is still there in the living cells of plants growing somewhere in the world right now, in rainforests and kitchen gardens and alpine meadows and roadsides, waiting in the patient way of chemistry for the next encounter, the next chapter of the long story that has been accumulating since the first human, being tasted a berry, they did not recognize and noticed what it did to their body and filed that information away in the deep, pre-linguistic archive of embodied knowledge. The scientists who will make the next discovery from a toxic plant, who will find in some alkaloid of the Amazon or some glycoside of an East African shrub the next treatment for the next cancer or the next neurological disease, are working somewhere tonight in lit laboratories or in the quiet of fieldwork, and the knowledge they will build on is continuous with the knowledge of every herbalist and shaman and poisoner and physician who came before them, a chain that reaches back to the very beginning of human curiosity about the world. Here, though, in this moment, in the room where you are resting, none of that is required of you. The plants have been catalogued, and the history has been traced, and the molecules have been named, and all of it can simply rest now in the background of the mind, like the distant sound of rain on leaves, like the soft flicker of candlelight in a room that is almost dark, like the slow and regular movement of breath in and out of a body that is growing, heavier and quieter with every passing moment. You are safe in this present hour. The garden is far away, The centuries have passed, the poisons are in their proper places, and the medicines are in theirs. And the world outside your window is simply the ordinary world, patient and quiet and still. Let the stories drift, let the names dissolve, let the long history of the plants and the people and the molecules settle into the soft and shapeless darkness of sleep, and rest now deeply and completely in the knowledge that the night is long and still and entirely yours.